everybody. Welcome to the Fire It Up with CJ show. Today we have Albert Flynn DeSilver here, and he is going to be talking about his book, Writing as a Path to Awakening. And so welcome, Albert.
Thank you so much, CJ. Delighted to be here.
So you're coming to Seattle on April 20th and 21st, and you're going to be teaching a class and doing a Friday on the 20th from 7:30 to 8:30, coming to East West Bookstore, talking about, I don't know, kind of an intro to your book, and then a kind of an on-hand session on the 21st and Saturday on 1 to 4. Well, I was watching a bunch of presentations on your website, and so you have kind of a harrowing story. Started drinking at age 12. As you have two parents, both of who are alcoholics. At 19, you describe yourself as a binge drinker. You got run over by a friend at a party in a car when you were passed out.
So embarrassing and shameful. But I ended up passing out drunk in a driveway at a party. And a friend of mine who, at some point, he was ready to leave the party at sort of 3 a.m. Obviously drunk himself, jumps in the car and he backs right over me. Having no idea that I'm there. And somehow he hears me screaming and he stops the car, drags my bleeding body into the back seat, drives drunk to the hospital. And I met there in the morning with my parents leaning over the bed rails, being very disappointed in me. So it's this like whole shame cycle that continued until another arrest. And eventually I do get sober and I moved to California to finally get some therapy and get some help. But I end up, instead of like in good old-fashioned traditional helpful therapy, I wind up in a psychedelic therapy cult. And then I get sucked into that whole vortex of drugs and inappropriate sexual behavior and no boundaries, and on it goes.
Okay, so first I have a question of what is a psychedelic therapy called?
Well, this is a thing. This is a California thing.
Oh my gosh, okay.
There was a part of it, there was an aspect of it that was traditional therapy, like, one-on-one talk therapy. I would go to a therapist's office. But then on the weekends, we would go off on and do these, what they called journeys, with all kinds of psychedelics, mushrooms, ayahuasca, LSD, you name it, and just like in insane amounts, and go on these bizarre, crazy, mind-altering journeys that were frightening, terrifying, but also revelatory in a lot of ways. And I get into that whole contradiction in the book. I mean, eventually the group, it wasn't a traditional cult per se, but it had a lot of the aspects of that. Being young and vulnerable and looking up to the leaders, the couple who ran this group, and they had all the power and all the influence, and there were sexual improprieties and boundary issues and all kinds of stuff. And I eventually extricated myself from the group and found a real therapist. and that was sort of the beginning of the transformation. Well, it's all transformation, It's all part of the process.
Yeah.
But,
you ever wondered, like, why did I start off with this psychedelic path?
I showed up in California, and as a young, I'm newly sober art student, and I was just totally clueless, and I still hadn't dealt with all the demons. I got sober. That was sort of the easy part for me in a way. But dealing with the reasons why I drank in the first place, that was the hard part. And I met a friend in graduate school, and he was in this group, and he'd been going to therapy, and he looked well-adjusted to me. So he's like, hey, you should come join my therapy group. And so I went to a few sessions, and it began as this kind of traditional therapy thing. And then then he would just come back with these tales, these fantastical tales of doing mushrooms and going on these incredible psychedelic journeys. And I was like, wow, and I used to go on tour with the Grateful Dead in the 80s. And so I had done some mushrooms, and I loved altering my world.
Right.
I thought, wow, this can be thought of as healing, as
Right.
medicine. That was kind of a trippy concept.
I'm on my path and listening to the Grateful Dead.
Exactly. So it's sort of like this extension. But then I realized that it really became an extension of avoidance for me.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, it was both things. It was avoidance, but it was also revelation. I mean, I learned a lot of incredible transformative things about like basically losing your mind, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Well,
isn't spiritual? It seems like that's what spiritual practice is about anyways. It's about losing your mind. So, I mean, there are lots of different ways of doing it. So why not through ayahuasca and mushrooms?
Exactly. So, but I do think it really takes a very solid container. People who are really, really healed themselves and can really hold that in a sacred and professional manner, which these two couldn't at the time.
I haven't watched it yet, but I've heard that there's Wild Wild Country, the story of Osho.
Oh, yes.
Talking about...
it's so good. It's so good.
I haven't watched... I only saw the first one, and I started feeling horrified, and then I thought, I don't know if I want to watch the rest. But I think it goes to show you.
It's disturbing.
Yeah, but I think that it... when you have that much power, I think that the boundaries, the corruption, it's all a possibility.
Exactly.
All right. So I can't remember. I think it was I can't remember if it was the TEDx or the interview, but you talk about being your final straw with this psychedelic quote unquote therapy group was to be kind of a trip where they tie you to a tree. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So this was an interesting journey. We would also do these weekend retreats out in remote areas in Northern California and Nevada. And usually they involved the quote-unquote medicines, but sometimes they didn't. And there was this one that we did up on Mount Diablo, appropriately enough, in the East Bay. And it was a men's group, and it was called the Dark Side.
Oh, man.
And there was this one night, and I think the intention was to explore the dark side of male being and male kind of aggression and so forth. And we were being led through all kinds of terrible harrowing exercises. And on the Saturday night, the main night, we're all sitting around in a circle around the fire. And it's like midnight, and my teacher is there with these strange henchmen guys I've never seen before. And he's wearing like a black hood. And he's having us write down on little pieces of paper everything that's ever meant anything to us in our lives, like the most important people and places and things and pets and everything, and then crumple up these pieces of paper and throw them into the fire.
Wow. So is this the intention to let go of your attachments? Is that
exactly?
Okay, got it.
Yeah, something like that. And I was getting very emotionally involved in this. And then there's this long period of silence. Nothing's happening. And suddenly he looks across the circle and points to me, and he goes, "You, any last words?" And I'm like, "What? What? What?" And then he says, "Take him!" He yells, "Take him!" And the henchmen guys, they get up, they run over to me, they throw a bag on my head, they drop me into a burlap sack, and they drag me out into the forest, and they tie me to this tree. And I'm like, what is... I'm 26 years old or 27 years old, and I am so spooked.
That's terrifying.
Oh, it was horrifying. And I'm bawling my eyes out and screaming for them to let me go. Nothing. They don't say a word. They leave me there, and I'm the first one they've done this to. So I think, this is it. And I'm out there for hours. All I can hear is the owls screeching and the coyotes yowling and the wild pigs snorting. And I think I'm going to die. I'm convinced I'm going to die. And in some ways, this feels way worse than losing my mind, on like 12 grams of mushrooms.
Right.
So I'm sitting there by the tree just weeping. And at some point, I just realized that I'm not going to die. I'm actually alive. And then suddenly there's this sort of rush of energy that just flows through my body. And in that moment, I just never felt more alive in my entire life. And I realized that if I ever get untied from this tree, I'm going to give myself fully to my creativity, my art, love, community, and I'm going to quit this psycho group. I'm just out of here. And so I did. It was a few months later I left the group and really devoted myself to writing and to teaching and learning how I could be of service in the world.
So then you went on to teach kids. You talk about this poetry reading where you were you found your calling in poetry, and when you found that calling, what at that moment called to you? Like tell us a little bit about when you had your aha moment about poetry and the poet, and when did that how did that inspire your writing?
Yeah, well, I had been in a MFA, Masters of Fine Arts program at the Art Institute in San Francisco, and I was just flailing around. I was lost. I even failed my year-end.
Yeah,
in photography.
Yeah.
And I even failed my year-end review.
Yeah.
Like, how do you do that? How do you fail at art? But so they made me redo it, and I eventually ended up passing. But before I left the Art Institute, there was this one night I was bumbling around in the studios, and Bill Berkson, who was one of my teachers there at the Art Institute, he was an art historian and a poet, and he said, "Hey, there's this poetry reading tonight. I'm going to be reading down at the Cal Theater. Do you want to come?" And I was like, "Poetry? I'm not really into that, but I don't have anything going on, so I guess I'll check it out." And so I go and I check out this reading, and it turns out it's the launch party for the Norton Anthology of Postmodern American Poetry. And it was a star-studded cast.
Wow.
Diane DePrimo was there, and Alice Notley flew in from Paris, and Ron Padgett, and all these amazing American poets, including Bill himself. And I was just floored, and I had never seen anything like that. And during the introduction to the anthology and the reading, Paul Hoover, who's the editor, he reads this quote from Jack Spicer, who's one of these Berkeley Renaissance poets from the 1950s, who was in the anthology. And he reads this one line from Spicer's famous imaginary elegies that goes, "The poet builds a castle on the moon made of dead skin and glass." And I thought, wow, that's weird. That's totally amazing. That's like incredible power with language and with words. And it created this image in my own mind that I was like, wow, I want to do that. What would it be like to do that? Forget this photography thing. And that was the night that I started writing. I'd always written in my journal, not always, but I had always, the last couple of years in art school, written in my journal. But now I wanted to try and write poetry. And I started playing more with language and with words. And I bought the anthology, and I started reading it. And then I started buying individual books by poets. And Bill would leave Xerox copies of out-of-print poetry books from his friends in my mailbox at school. And it just kind of took off from there.
And do you remember your first poem?
My first poem that I ever wrote?
Yeah.
I would have to. I don't remember the exact first poem. I think it was, or maybe I don't want to remember it because it really wasn't very good. But I do have this one collection that I put together early on in the mid to late 90s of just some poems I'd been tinkering with for a while. And it was called something like all the something about the dismantled angles.
Wow.
It was like this abstract. Here it is. It was called Another Right Angle Dismantled. And so I think one of my first poems was in there, which it's not really worthy of
You're not going to read it
recitation,
to
but
us, okay?
no, no. But there were a couple poems that wound up in there that eventually I edited and submitted to journals. And I do remember the first poetry journal that I submitted to. It was called Explosive Magazine.
Nice.
And yeah, I know, right? With a name like that,
Yeah.
I wanted to hang out with those people. And it was some young poets from New York and San Francisco, mainly. And it was just a staple-bound little journal.
Mm-hmm.
But there was an artist, this guy David Larson, really terrific artist, who did all the screen printing for the covers.
Mm.
And I submitted a couple of poems, and lo and behold, they printed them. And the 20-year anniversary edition, they put together an anthology that's supposed to come out this year. And so I just saw those poems again for the first time in a really long time. I was like, wow, those aren't half bad. Those really aren't too bad. So it's kind of a trip, 20 years later. It's the whole sense of time.
Yeah.
It never ceases to astonish me.
All right, so in the last 20 years, you've been studying with, I don't even know how to pronounce this Thai meditation master's name, Ajahn Jumnian?
Oh, Jumnian, yeah.
Jumnian.
Yeah.
And Jack Cornfield and Adyashanti. So tell me how these teachers have influenced you and how that kind of flowed into your writing process.
Yeah, well, right around this time that I graduated from the Art Institute, I got into this poetry thing. A friend of mine took me out to this. I used to drive out to Point Reyes all the time to take pictures and to write. It's really beautiful. Mm-hmm. And on the way out, I used to see this sign on the side of the road through in the San Geronimo Valley, on the way out to Point Reyes along Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. There's this sign that said Spirit Rock Mediation Center. And I always thought, like, what is a mediation center? And my friend was like, no, dummy, it's meditation center. And I was so clueless, I didn't even really know what this whole meditation thing was. And I read it as mediation. Anyways, so eventually she said, hey, let's go to this Monday night class. This guy, Jack Cornfield, is going to be teaching, and I think you'll like it. So I went, and there was Jack, and during his talk, he had us sit, as is the format of his class. He does a 30 to 40-minute sit in silence, and then he'll do a talk for about 45 minutes or so. Mm-hmm. And during that talk, it was almost all poetry. He was sort of devoting the evening to poetry and the connection between poetry and spirituality. And he was reading Rumi poems, and he was reading Mary Oliver poems, and it just kind of blew my mind, like, oh, here's this intersection of spirituality and creativity. What is that? And so I was kind of hooked. And then I found it so healing to be just sitting in silence and allowing things to come up in their natural order and to face the truth of them. That it just became a very powerful premise for me.
Okay, so that was your kind of aha moment, like, wow, there's this potentiality and there's this interaction of spirituality and creativity. What have you discovered over time? Because this is an area where you've been like living and dwelling in the space of these two in spirituality and creativity. What have you discovered?
Well, I think that it's really ultimately one song, that the practice of meditation, the practice of being in the world is the same, like you bring that same intentionality and desire for presence and desire for showing up fully in the world, you bring that to the practice of writing and creativity. And that changes everything because, at the beginning I used to write from my head, from all my brilliant ideas that I learned from, in college and going to school and reading a lot and thinking I was sort of some kind of smarty pants.
Yeah.
And, it wasn't until I really started delving deep into meditation practice and into movement and writing from the heart and writing from the bones and from the interior viscera of my body that the writing really started getting interesting because it was real. It wasn't this sort of like, it wasn't my mind trying to control what I thought people would like or what was hip or what was, what I thought was interesting. It was about just the reality of my direct experience. And then it became much more emotional and much more real. And so now it's an integrative practice of sitting in silent meditation and then facing the blank page. And the blank page is silence. It's spaciousness, right? And so then I fill that with, thoughts and ideas and reflections. And it may show up as a poem. It may show up as a memoir. It may show up as, in this day and age, a novel that's I've been working on. And so that's the journey of presence that is applied to both the page and also to daily life.
So I understand what it means. So I'm actually starting the writing process myself for exactly the same reason and what I am finding is that different aspects of myself are showing up, or things that I didn't realize were issues are just kind of bubbling to the surface seemingly out of nowhere. Like for me, it was my dad's death a long time ago that I feel like I've processed, but I've just had to process over and over again in many forms until I can truly let go. Like as that psychedelic guru had yelled at you.
Yeah.
So when you say meditation and going to your heart and your bones, what does that mean?
I think it's really about the courage for showing up truly in your body. The thing I love about insight meditation, also known as Vipassana meditation, is that it's very body-centric. It's not like, because meditation is so powerful, and when you can go into the mind in a way that it can almost be an escape. But with Vipassana meditation, it asks us to go into the body, into the heart, repeatedly. And there's really no escape from that. Your mind is so brilliant that it can trick you. But when you're present to your body, it's all about reality, and there's no hiding out. And studying with someone like Ajahn Jumnian, he'd been trained in all kinds of shamanic practices and movement practices, and he would have us doing all kinds of interesting body scans and movement things that would help us integrate the silence. And so when things come up, as they inevitably do, and remember, it is endless, so there's endless layers to the onion of fear or doubt or grief or whatever. It just kind of keeps on going, and we're never going to completely figure it all out. And I think there's some liberation in that truth. But anyways, this is what I offer in my writing practices and on the retreats, is that we get into the body, and I guide people through various movement exercises, different styles of meditation that get us in our bodies. And then the writing can come directly out of that, as opposed to exclusively out of thinking mind.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand this, because so having written some stuff myself, not in advance, I'm a very novice writer. I'm a reluctant writer, someone who doesn't even want to write, but has been asked over and over by spirit to write. So that's where I'm coming from.
I can totally relate.
Okay, so and I've done shamanic practices. So
great.
Yeah, so I understand the idea of using something to get access to the different part of your brainwave. I've never used movement. I know at least when I'm writing when I've been writing my own stories, my writing teacher has encouraged me to relive the experience from, a sensations standpoint. So I imagine, what it smelled like, what did it look like, what did it feel like? But I'm kind of imagining that I don't know if I'm, and then sometimes when I'm imagining, like, what is it that I'm feeling at that moment, I relive the experience. I can feel like a pain in my heart, or I feel a pain in my
Mm-hmm.
stomach. Is that what you mean
Yeah.
by movement?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's really it. Getting engaged in direct sensory experience and the subtlety of sensation,
Mm,
and really being with that, and practicing giving words to that, without sort of overthinking it, but trying to write directly from the sensation or from the sense experience.
mm,
And it's really dramatic, and it's really wild. I mean, I'm continually amazed at how powerfully people are able to express when they surrender to that very
mm,
practice.
mm-hmm.
And that's why the subtitle of the book is "A Year to Becoming an Excellent Writer and Living an Awakened Life." And it seems absurd to say, "Oh yeah, you can be an excellent writer in a year," but that's partly, that was just like a framework that would sort of help guide people through the practices in the book. But in my experience, people can become an excellent writer in an instant when they let go of that doubting mind, they let go of that expectation mind, or that conditioned mind that says, you can't do it, you're not good enough, it should be this way, don't do that, do this,
Mm-hmm.
and you just meet the page with the true experience of your heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm with my last. I've been writing this article, and it's now on its seventh revision, and
Uh-huh.
it started off with just a meditative state and writing from the heart. And then everyone in the class is like, I don't know where the hell you are. You're in some
Uh-huh.
conceptual space that we don't understand. So
Uh-huh.
please do some scene setting and go in and relive every single momentary detail from moment to moment, from when you go to the meditation retreat all the way to when you get a death threat in Hawaii. So go through that
Mm.
whole
Wow.
experience, and and so I wrote it once from the heart. I then edited it again and rewrote it from the kind of sensory perspective, and then
Mm-hmm.
I edited it from, like, does this even flow and make sense as a logical story? Is there a scene progression?
Mm-hmm.
Is it clear? And then
Right.
I've edited it over, and then it started with 7,000 words down to 4,000 words, now to 1,248 words was my last edit.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this
Beautiful.
process back and forth, and you talk about the the rational mind meeting the kind of spiritual voice. What does that? That's at least my sense of what it is for me. What is it for you?
Yeah, well, I think it's both and, right? So I always start with free writing,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of subconscious writing, allowing what's there in the moment just to be there in the moment, so I'm out of my own way.
Mm-hmm.
And I let it be crap. I let it be erratic. I let it be unpredictable. I let it be uncontrolled. And I just write urgently, write quickly. I try and outpace my controlling thinking
Mm-hmm.
conditioned mind. And often what I end up with is a mess,
Mm-hmm.
which is great, which is liberating. But a lot of people can't tolerate a mess, and I think that's part of the practice is being able to tolerate a mess,
Mm-hmm.
and to tolerate, allow yourself to write crap. This is very liberating,
Right.
for people like me who have a certain expectation about what it's supposed to look like,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so then becomes the writing process, the editing process, where you go back and you reread out loud, and then you type it up, and then you type it a second time, and you read that out loud, and then you type it a third time, and then you read that out loud, and you add sensory details, and then you pull out the sensory details, and then you look at models for frameworks to contain the story, so it has a beginning, a middle, and end. So it's able to be shared with other people, and it makes sense, some kind
Mm-hmm.
of logical order, depending on what you're writing. In this
Right.
case, if it's an article and you want to convey some information with a lot of readers, then it has to make sense. Poetry, on the other hand, doesn't have to make logical sense in that same way. But what I forget who it was said, all writing is rewriting. It's so true. So true.
So what do you think of people so there are people who are on both ends of the spectrum, right? You talk about, trying to get it writing and have it editorially perfect, right? But then you have people who are, this is a channeled work and I don't want to touch it because this is like divinely inspired. How do you manage? My writing teacher says, yeah, tell the channeled person that you need to channel an editor.
Exactly. No, I love that. I was going to say something kind of similar, but it's true. And it's totally up to people to allow the work and the writing to live in whatever way they want. If you want to write channeled writing in your journal for yourself to get clarity on what you think and emotional experiences and so forth, that's awesome. That's great. And if you are looking to have an audience and get your work out there in the world, it's going to be a collaborative effort, and it's going to take your trusted readers and some editors to bounce ideas off of, which isn't to say you can't keep some elements and aspects of your channeled vision in your work. And maybe there is such a thing as just purely channeled writing. People talk about it like that all the time, and yet when you really dig a little deeper and ask a lot of questions, you realize, well, yeah, it's channeled, but it was also heavily edited. Right. So I think of for example, someone like Esther, Jerry and Esther Hicks. Like Esther Hicks, sure, all that stuff is channeled, but it's also edited and filtered through her human mind, and she puts on an amazing show, and that's not to deny the truth of the channeling, but it's also to say, put it in a little bit of perspective, like, yeah, there's a little bit of show personship here, there's a little bit of editing happening, and that's all in the service of communicating with your audience. I think.
Got it. That makes sense to me. And I think it's, there's all these different archetypes. And so one archetype is the sage. And the sage is supposed to take these spiritual lessons and translate it to the mass. And so so I think that's what I'm hearing you say. As is a priest, these are people who take the spiritual guidance and translate it to the mass. And the operative word is translate. You just don't spew out everything, is what I'm hearing you say, because it's maybe not relatable to another person. Or sometimes someone said to me, sometimes those messages are specifically to you. So, you have to make it generalized to a general audience, which I think also is kind of a good point with respect to. And I think it's the challenge in writing in the style that you're talking about, I think, is kind of what is what is my authentic voice, what is presentable to, and what is relatable to a general audience. I assume that is one of the biggest challenges.
Sure, and I think it's incredibly helpful to find your models, to really look and do a lot of reading and find okay, who really inspires me? Who kind of gets me to the page,
right?
And kind of gives me almost a sense of permission that I too can share what I think and feel and know about the world. And then you read carefully, and you read with a pen and a notebook, and you underline things, and you practice your sentences, and it's sort of like doing your drills. If you're a distance swimmer, it's not like you just jump in the pool and swim like crazy and hope for the best.
Right.
No, you go to swim practice every day and you do your drills. You do the short drills, you do the long drills, you do some stretching in the gym when you're out of the pool, you do some sprinting, you do some push-ups. And I think the same thing applies to writing, that we have to do our drills. We have to read carefully and reread, and we have to write many drafts and even, rewrite, pick out favorite paragraphs and rewrite them ourselves and see what it's all about and see how we can apply our own ideas and our own sense of syntax and word choice to what we want to say.
Yeah, I want to switch paths a little bit. I want to
Sure.
talk to you about you make a statement that writing is a path to awakening and that you're
Yes.
living an awakened life. So help me understand how writing has awakened you.
Well, I think that it's it's interesting. Writing is sort of one of these. Well, a couple things. So, writing is one of the most primary concentrated points of focus we have as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Like where our attention just kind of like burns into the page.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think about wanting to make something manifest in our lives, we can write it down. And it goes from our mind to the page, from our mind to physical reality. It's almost sort of this little kind of step through the veil from spirit into matter. And I mean, I found in my own experience, when there is something I desire in my life, when I write it down, when I get very specific about it, it becomes manifest. When
You're
I
like
give my
writing
attention,
cheeseburger and fries. Like, what is it? That
Yeah,
what are the
exactly.
things that you're writing?
I did that just yesterday, and lo and behold, there was a cheeseburger and fries. It was delicious. But fortunately, it was organic and
good,
artisanal
exactly.
and all that. So, but no, I mean, seriously, so there's that aspect of it, but then there's also the aspect of writing to get a sense of what we think, right? And what is our sense of spirituality? What is our sense of this embodied life? What does that mean to us? And to write that down, I think, is part of the spiritual journey, part of the spiritual practice, to reflect on that, to integrate what we know and what we experience and what we read. And it just becomes part of the communicative spiritual journey.
So, give me an example, maybe a recent example or an example where you discovered an aspect of yourself through writing and how you reflected and integrated that.
That's an interesting question. Gosh, I guess the most, and I'm not sure if it's integrated yet, but I've been working on this new novel for, I think I'm on like 3.5 or 4 years, and it's getting close to completion. And my main protagonist is a 17-year-old young woman, and so I'm like, talk about channeling. So I had 4 years ago, I was teaching this workshop. I was hosting a workshop with Cheryl Strayed out in Maui, and one night during the workshop, I had this dream, and this young woman showed up, and she was in jail, and I don't know how she got there or who she was, but she was in jail, and she was just this like feisty, angry, grief-stricken young woman. I was like, "What are you doing here?" It was almost like she was like, "Write me down. I don't know what I'm doing here, but write me down." So I just started writing her down and sketching her out as a character, and I didn't question like what this was about or where this was coming from, as strange as it was. I just sort of went with it, and I was like, this sounds like a story. And this young woman has a story. What is their story? What is she doing in jail? And so that just set me off on this journey into creating the story. And I think, like, I don't know what I'm learning from this. I mean, I'm learning a lot about empathy and seeing from the female perspective and trying to integrate my own inner teenage girl. One of my editors said to me, she's like, "Were you ever once a teenage girl?" Like, and I said, I must have been in another life form or something, I guess, because I seem to have gotten a little bit of the language down and just the emotional dynamic and the relationship between her and her mom and her and her best friend. And so somehow I'm trying to integrate my inner teenage girl.
And I find this fascinating. I find this whole conversation
I
fascinating.
know. I have no idea if I'm successful, but so far it seems like people are liking the book in draft form.
Okay, so what have you learned? So
So what have I learned?
yeah, like
Okay.
how do you
Well,
feel like how does being as you've integrated and written and rewritten and try to channel the voice of this, belligerent, feisty, woman, young girl, what have you discovered about yourself?
I think I've discovered just another layer of compassion,
Mm,
and that my true work in this lifetime is to cultivate empathy, to cultivate compassion
mm,
for all people, because you never know what anyone's going through
mm-hmm,
in any given moment. When someone cuts you off in traffic, or someone's extremely rude to you, steps on your foot, in line at the bank or whatever,
mm-hmm,
um, you don't have any idea like what their deal is,
mm,
and how what particular trauma is going on in their life, or
mm-hmm,
whether they're self-medicating, or what,
mm-hmm,
and all of these things that I've experienced as a human being. And yet, oftentimes we just take it as an offense. How could that person be so impatient? How could they be so obnoxious? Well, people are only that way when they're in a state of duress
mm,
and grief. So
mm-hmm,
this whole practice of writing this book has really been kind of an exercise in empathy and compassion.
mm,
And, particularly with all this stuff going on with the Me Too movement
mm-hmm,
and the sexual improprieties of men, it's like, how do men go inside in a courageous way and realize that their behavior is hurtful,
mm-hmm,
is offensive, is obnoxious, and disturbing and detrimental to a woman's experience.
mm.
And so I'm hoping that through the practice of writing this book that I can wake up that sense of empathy in the reader. Um, so we'll see.
Well, I think you
We'll
bring
see.
an interesting perspective because you bring both sides into the dialogue. Because I think it's hard. I mean, as a male, you have all these, you can kind of understand from the female perspective, from your writing, what may be happening but you also understand the flip side as a male perspective. So I think it's kind of an interesting tension between those two. And are there certain ways in which you now behave differently as a result of this empathy?
Whew, I hope so. I think I still need more time to integrate.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting time in my life. I'm in between book projects, and there's just stuff going on personally and relationship dynamics and so forth. And so we'll see. I mean, this whole project has been really kind of an exercise in risk taking
Yeah,
too, to see if like it's
absolutely.
possible. Like,
Yeah.
who am I to write from the female perspective? I mean, that's like, I'm a middle-aged white guy. Like, who?
Right.
That's like a crazy idea. Am I supposed to leave that voice for women
Yeah.
or for
Well,
women of color? I mean, there's a racial dynamic going on in this book. There's a lot of stuff that I'm looking to understand as a human being,
right.
um, as a
Well, I
male,
think it,
white, privileged human being,
well,
and,
I
and
think
trying to
it's,
get at that through writing a novel.
yeah, to me, it's like okay, so, whether you're with this Thai meditation master, Jack Cornfield, or Adi Ashanti, I mean, if we're all trying to become one with each other, and so really, it's the true experience of oneness, right? In some ways, this is a spiritual exercise as much as it is a personal growth exercise. Don't you think?
Absolutely. Oh, totally. No, and I think that ultimately writing is a journey toward consciousness. It's a journey toward compassion and a journey toward love. Um, I mean, I know that's the case with my intention around this book. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's really it's a love story. It's a story about surviving grief. It's a story about understanding other people's perspectives
Mm-hmm.
and experiences, and dealing with loss.
Mm. All right, I'm gonna
So
change the. I can't actually wait to see it. I look forward to actually when it hits the shelf. It's exciting. It's exciting.
yeah, me too. And I just, I'm just changing agents as we speak.
Yeah,
I've had this one agent for 2 years, and things weren't really happening in the way that I hoped they would. And so
yeah,
now I don't have an agent, and it feels very untethering as a writer to
yeah,
not have an agent.
yeah,
uh, but I do have this new book that I'm feel really excited about. So.
yeah. Well, the last question is, it seems like there's all sorts of, storylines, arcs, structures. There's the hero's journey, the one that I hear all the time. There's probably others.
Hmm.
If you
Sure.
were to look at your life as an arc of a whole story, how would you describe? You taught you, and somehow your story starts at age 12 when I hear it online. But what would you say is like if you were to do the short storyboard version of your life, what would it be?
Well, I do. It does resonate. The whole Joseph Campbell mythic
Mm-hmm.
journey, hero's journey thing. It does resonate um, for me, and I actually used that model, which is beautifully articulated by this guy Vogler, Christopher Vogler,
Mm-hmm.
in The Writer's Journey, and I used that as a model in my memoir to kind of write because it just seemed like a cool structure and a good
Mm-hmm.
way to just organize things so that the narrative would flow and it wouldn't be just this thing happened and then that thing happened and that thing happened to the end.
Mm-hmm.
But that there would be actually a storyline and there would be
Mm-hmm.
antagonists and me, the protagonist, and I would be coming up against obstacles and hopefully overcome that obstacle or not. And there would be some sort of redemptive sort of flow. Um, and it's a model, but like every model and framework, I think people should experiment
Mm.
and tinker with and expand and sort of blow them up and put them back together in their own way
Mm.
and see how it works for them because it's
Mm-hmm.
not just like linear narrative is just one way of presenting story and language to
Mm.
the world. I mean, if you think about Native American stories, they're certainly not like chronological.
Right.
time is completely elastic, and it's like random stuff just kept popping into place with no seeming organization. It's quite magical, and yet to communicate in our particular culture, I think it does help to make it easy on some level, which isn't to
Okay.
say you can't be creative.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out. Okay, so here's my narrative based on the limited data that I have on you, right? So,
Okay.
young boy, young boy has two alcoholic parents and this Brum Hulda, I don't know, something like this evil evil uh,
Evil governess. Yeah.
governess who shames and guilts you constantly. All right, so you're kind of in this guilty hellhole. You then shame-ridden hellhole. You then go into this. Finally, you have your aha moment where you are. I don't know. It seems like at age 19, something happened where you had your wake-up call. You then go on the journey to discover who you are. You enter into this psychedelic cult. You then find poetry, and then I don't know
The
where the
golden
story.
chalice.
The golden chalice. Then what happens? I don't know. How would you describe? So I don't know all the different aspects of your life clearly, and I only have it left up to whatever little fragments I can see online. How would you
Yeah.
describe your
I mean,
journey?
that's kind of it so far. I mean, there's still. I'm hoping I've got like a bunch more years to go. But uh, yeah, I mean, so these things happen, and life is much more stable now. And
Mm-hmm.
as I say in Writing is the Path to Awakening about writing memoir, it's you want to, well, not about writing memoir. Writing memoir is about writing your own story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so you're kind of living that drama out. But it's nice to be able to write fiction and dramatize things and not have to live
Ah,
out
okay.
that drama.
Yes.
you know.
Right.
But yeah, in some ways, we're all living some kind of a heroine's or a hero's journey towards integration, right? Towards redemption of some kind. And I don't know if that's an archaic concept, redemption. I'm not even sure what that means exactly, but really maybe more towards just an awakened presence. And that's the place to arrive at, as if it was a static place, which it is not. But just bringing the fullest, most heartfelt, present self that you possibly can in any given moment.
Yeah. So the hero learns something from their journey, and then they come back and bring to their gift to other people. So yours is the gift of creativity, love, compassion, empathy through discovering of self through writing.
That's it.
Period.
You got it. Perfect. You're hired. We're going on the road together.
Excellent.
I love it.
All right. So we've been talking to Albert Flynn DeSilver about his book and his journey here to the Northwest on April 20th and 21st at the East West Bookstore. Come and see him and enjoy the process of discovery yourself. Tell us about your website and any other information you want listeners to hear.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So if people want to experience the whole writing transformational path to awakening live, come to East West and come to those workshops up in Seattle. And on June 8th through the 10th, I'm doing a weekend intensive in the Redwoods at the 1440 Multiversity, which is down in Santa Cruz, California. And it's an amazing, amazing, groovy new retreat center.
And you will not be tied to trees, right?
No, you will not be tied to trees, I promise. You'll be able to relax in the infinity pool, which is much better. Anyway, so there's that, and then you can check out all the other events at albertflynndesilver.com.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. I would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.